You're listening to the Transforming Society podcast. I'm Richard Kemp, and on this episode, I'm joined by Ian Cummins, Senior Lecturer in the School of Health and Society at the University of Salford, and Martin King, an independent scholar and author. Ian and Martin's new book, True Crime, Key Themes and Perspectives, co-written with Louise Wattis and published by Bristol University Press, analyses in depth the phenomenon of true crime. From Lucy Letby to Fred and Rose West, all the way back to Jack the Ripper, chances are you're familiar with at least one famed serial killer. And true crime is big business. Documentaries, dramatizations, books, and now one of its most popular ever formats, the podcast. As of 2024 in the USA, an estimated 119 million people over the age of 13 listen to true crime podcasts. That's according to Edison Research. It makes true crime the third most listened to genre in podcasting, at least in the USA. The story in the UK is very similar. In their new book, Ian, Martin, and Louise break down the big stories in true crime, revealing the genre's social and cultural impacts, and also considering its ethical implications and wider influence on crime and punishment. Ian Cummins and Martin King, welcome to the Transforming Society podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't consider myself to be a true crime fan per se. Not that I don't watch and listen and things like that, but I'm very aware that like it's a fanatical genre that a lot of people really love. And while I may not be that kind of a person, I'm very aware of a lot of these criminals that you talk about in your book. And so just like taking an academic lens to something that I'm sure all of us are so kind of aware of, whether it's in a big way or in a small way. I was just really excited to read your book and now to talk to you guys about it today. Martin, can I ask you first? So we have books, documentaries, dramatizations, podcasts. Why does true crime fascinate us so very much? And where did this fascination first come from?
I suppose it starts with like an obsession with death in some ways. And then if you extrapolate from that, then true crime is often about sudden death, violent death, unexpected death. There's a kind of morbid fascination with it that goes back a long way. I mean, you mentioned Jack the Ripper, but before that, if you think about public executions, public hangings, etc., which was seen as a kind of a day out for the family in the 19th century.
Wow.
So it goes a long way back. You know, if you've Tale of Two Cities that we all read at school, Madame Defarge and the guillotine and all that sort of thing. So there's this long history, I suppose, of an obsession with it. True crime, I suppose, as a genre, is about a kind of fictionalization of the facts, really, and a dramatization of things that are based loosely on real crimes. So obviously you've got a whole load of programs, documentaries, podcasts about actual cases. But if you think about popular programs like, you know, the US series Law and Order, which has been running for a long time, very popular, and it's all its variations really. They are based loosely on real cases as well, and so, I mean, we've written previous to this. I suppose we've written a lot of stuff about police procedurals and why people like, you know, crime programs per se. And one of the things I think about that is that they're kind of comforting in a way, in that it's, you know, they usually solve a crime. Police procedurals often last an hour, things like Law and Order. And at the end, you know, the bad guys always get away, mainly. The occasional twist to the plot, etc. And certainly with some of these programs, serial killers, you know, are quite useful in those weekly programs, in that you can have a whole series of people tracking, you know, one particular serial killer, etc.
So, as you were saying at the beginning, Rich, it's almost impossible to escape. And that's something we found when writing about true crime. You can't really escape it in a good way and a bad way, in that crime dominates the media. You can see this week, you know, release of prisoners and so on. Obviously, that's not necessarily a true crime, but it shows the power of media interest. And the thing about true crime is that, well, one of the things is that there's an endless supply of stories going back from wherever you want to, really. I mean, you know, real and then based on real. So, you know, if you looked at TV detectives, you've had everything from a monk as a TV detective in Cadfael to, for older listeners, Eddie Shoestring, the radio DJ who wore pajamas, who was a detective. So it kind of crime gets into everywhere, and true crime Particularly, there's been an explosion, I think, with podcasting because it's podcasting and true crime is a meeting of, form and genre that is just ideal because it's, people can access podcasts when and where they want. They can then follow through a story. They may know the story, but often podcasts are, because the news, 24-hour news, picks up a story, drops it. Podcasts often claim, one of their claims to authenticity is that this is a deep dive. This is a, we're going to look at the real facts. You may have seen this on the news that so and so has been convicted of these offences. We're going to go past the headlines and look at it in depth. And then again, of course, it's a market, isn't it? It's huge resources, as you say, the numbers of listeners. If you took true crime off Netflix or other streaming services, there probably wouldn't be that much on them, to be honest.
That's true.
Um, so I think all those things, and people are fascinated by these issues. Why do people commit these crimes? So I think one of the aspects of true crime recently is this kind of a rise of psychological profilers and explanations for the individuals concentrate on these things to give you some understanding of why people have committed these horrendous crimes. Often those, well, almost without exception, those individuals making those comments have not actually assessed in a professional way or had any contact with the people who've committed those crimes. But it provides a sense of meaning, I think, to people, and there's a kind of narrative structure there. This explains these horrendous events. So this kind of psychobiography of convicted killers is huge business.
Quite often it doesn't explain them at all, though, does it? But that's the claim when they say we're going to have a deep dive. Deep dive is doing a lot of heavy lifting a lot of the time because it's tinkering around the edges, or like you say, trying to apply psychological theory and come up with the answer. We've had some contact with the author David Peace in the past, and one of his things is, why are people so obsessed with this question of why in that place at that time? And it's a question that quite often can't be answered. But a lot of these programs would claim to be, giving you the answer to that question.
And a high profile crime is often presented as telling us something about society at that period, which it may be, it may not, but some of those claims are made. So if you look at a very high profile crime, like the murder of Jamie Bulger in the early 90s, you look at the commentary around that crime, it's seen as telling you something about children in the 1990s, as though the perpetrators of that appalling crime are representative in some way of 10-year-olds in Britain at that period, where obviously they weren't. And one of the most difficult things, I think, is that, as Martin was saying about the answers, is sometimes there aren't answers. And that in itself, or the answer may be that something that's even more unpalatable. The idea that somebody committed a violent offence and they did that because for their own gratification or sexual gratification is actually quite an appalling thought. But that's a very difficult thing to take on board. It's easier to say, this person is evil.
Earlier in your book, in the early pages of your book, you talk about Truman Capote's In Cold Blood as kind of like a seminal, kind of like a culture shifting text. Can you talk about like the importance, like what was this book and what was its importance?
Well, Capote saw a report of a murder in a three-line report in the New York Times of a murder in Kansas in 1959, and he then went and researched in his claims. He went and spent time in that area, researched, wrote about the background to the crime. In fact, met the two people who were later executed for the crime. So Capote became, and In Cold Blood became a sensation, made Capote's fortune, and so on. But it's a seminal work because of, first of all, it's a literary figure. Capote was already an extremely well-known American novelist. So it's a literary figure engaging with crime in a way in which crime had been seen as pulp fiction, sort of not given artistic status that perhaps it should have been. So Capote brings that to the work, but also Capote, in a sense, led a new version of true crime, in that he was approaching it, making claims that he was writing the real story. But when you go back and look at In Cold Blood, it's kind of, is it a novel? Is it fiction? Is it something between the two, which Capote claimed? So he was making claims for authenticity, but actually invented some of the scenes, and it's been criticised at the time for some of the inventions. But one of the major things about that work is that Capote is the central character
Mm.
in the work. So it's not about him, but it's about he's central. It's a kind of example of that gonzo journalism, putting himself at the center of the story, and writing around his views and so on. So, in that way, that's become something of a template for true crime, I think, later forms. So, if you look at the podcast again, you can see that the podcasters are putting themselves in the center of the story, and their reactions are as important as to the facts.
Yeah, and that's true of a lot of, I mean, in the book, we'll probably get to Lucy Letby later, but in the book, there's a chapter on the Letby case, and certainly the panorama documentaries around that are very much about the journalists placing themselves very excitedly at the centre of the story. So, in that sense, I think Capote's work is kind of a template of for what's come afterwards, really.
You talked earlier about authenticity. In your book, you say that true crime makes claims for authenticity and validity, but it also plays with fact and fiction for dramatic purposes. What effects does this interplay have on the public and also on policymakers and both of their perceptions of crime?
I think the first thing is that these presentations, if you like, they are saying that this is the true story. So any claim to authenticity has to be treated with some caution, I think, because clearly you cannot get all the details of a very complicated trial, for example, into a even to an hour documentary or, a series of documentaries. The Letby trial that Martin mentioned, that lasted over a year, I think. So the level of detail and so on that's involved in that case is just impossible for the general public, including ourselves, to keep up with almost. So the thing about these representations, be they drama, be they Channel 4 kind of gritty police procedurals or fly on the wall documentaries, they're all a narrative construct. They're all because it would be impossible to follow an investigation. So if you followed a police investigation for 24 hours, most of it would be having interviewed police officers about this sort of work. Most of it would be really tedious because it's
Mhm.
people,
Mm.
increasingly now looking at CCTV, etc., etc. So the investigation, the way that that's presented is constructed in a particular way, and then that affects the way in which people view the operation of the criminal justice system. So the criminal justice system is a really important area of public and policy, but actually very few people have that much contact with it or direct contact with it. So
Mm.
I haven't, well, I worked as a probation officer, so I had quite a lot of contact with it, but how many people have actually been in a prison, visited somebody in a prison, been on a jury, those kinds of things. So the workings of the criminal justice system are hidden from us, not necessarily deliberately on a practical level, but then they become very high profile stories. So this week's mistaken release of prisoners, is a fantastic example of the way in which something that's happened actually happens quite a lot, it seems, suddenly becomes a huge story. And we're aware of this, whereas people have been released from prison mistakenly at various points. Well, it seems every day from what the media are reporting, but
Mm.
that's not being reported every day. So
Mm.
I think our views of these, it's really important. Crime and punishment is a really important area of public policy, and it's people's view of the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, sentencing, and so on. All those can be influenced by high-profile cases, which the ones that true crimes concentrate on.
And I think, public opinion is kind of shaped by, we talk a lot in the book about the relationship between the mass media and the, criminal justice system and the representation of true crime, I suppose. And as Ian said, a lot of this is a kind of a narrative construct of a story without looking at the complexity. And yet people's opinions are, formed by watching these things, I would say. And then they think they know what needs to be done with the criminal justice system, the failings of etc., etc., etc. But it's kind of dangerous in some ways, I think, because As Ian said, it tries to simplify something that's actually quite complex.
Mhm.
But certainly people, certain cases, get right into the public imagination, and everybody's got an opinion about them and what's gone wrong and what should be done in the future, etc., etc., etc.
Does the seeing true crime documentaries, podcasts, books, etc., as like you're saying that the criminal justice system is a vast and complex thing, which makes perfect sense, and yet these true crime programs are so fascinating. We can just like, oh, 6 episodes to really get into the details of what really happened because we're not actually being told. Does that like that mindset, does that kind of reflect or have an effect on it just makes me think of like politics, for example, and like how often like going home and chatting to family and everyone tells me how much they're being lied to by their political leaders. It just I wonder, like, is there a connection between these two things?
I think there's something there about the way in which, particularly populist politicians, are always appealing to the general public over the heads of, liberal elites like me as a probation officer or civil servants and so on who are making these decisions, who make decisions in the Home Office or whatever it would be, as though there is a kind of liberal. Dominic Cummins might say a criminal justice blob against increased punishments and so on and so forth. Whereas actually, in England and Wales, the prison population's grown by about 20,000 in the past 15 years, which most people wouldn't know.
Wow.
They would think that prisons are, well, I don't know, not speaking on people's behalf, but the perceptions of prisons are very much, they're not tough enough, they're not this, they're not that. Whereas actually, you look at the reports from Her Majesty's Inspectors of Prisons and so on and so forth, they put a picture of a failing regime of, overcrowded prisons, poorly paid, recruited and difficult to recruit staff, drugs, violence, and so on. So, for example, there's been in a maximum security prison, Wakefield, there have been 2 murders in the past month
In the prison.
in the
Yeah.
prison. Yeah.
Wow.
So that is not gonna be presented in headlines in those ways. But actually, what?
This is right back to the beginning, really, and the question about why people fascinated by true crime, because, crime and punishment or being seen to be tough on crime has been like a central issue for political parties for, well, I'll say the past 50 years, but it's probably longer than that.
It is.
But it's certainly something that's,
In fact, I've written a book for Policy Press about
you have indeed.
Thank you very much.
that. Get that one in. But it's true, and there's almost we don't, prisons. Well, I have a particular view that prisons fail, but the failure of prisons seems to lead to the demands for more prisons,
Mm.
which is not true of any other institution I'm ever
Mm.
familiar with. And we don't have a debate about, actually we spend a lot of money on incarcerating people. What is the value of that? What as taxpayers, etc., etc., what value are we getting out of that? So, I mean, in terms of true crime's influence, I think there are, well, the developments in true crime is that there are a series of podcasts and cases that are more critical of the institutions of the criminal justice system in that the way that they fail victims, particular groups of victims, victims of sexual violence and domestic violence and so on. So there's a critical format coming out there that's taking actually perhaps a different kind of perspective on these issues.
Hi, this is Richard Kemp from the Transforming Society podcast. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you'd like to buy a copy of True Crime by Ian Cummins, Martin King, and Louise Wattis, we have a 50% discount code for the paperback and ebook versions, valid until the 31st of December 2025. Just go to bristoluniversitypress.co.uk, search for True Crime, select either the paperback or ebook version, and enter TC50 at checkout. That's TC50 at checkout. Now, back to the episode. Can you tell us about the Central Park Five and what part did true crime media play in their convictions?
In the book, one of the things that we wanted to look at was the influence of true crime on, penal policy. And as I said before, one of the things that's biggest social policy you see there in that area of penal policy is the increase in the use of imprisonment. The Central Park Five, we use that as an example because in the case in 1989, a jogger called Tricia Melly, who wrote a memoir some years later about her experience of this case. She was attacked, raped, brutally assaulted, and left for dead in Central Park. And Tricia Melley was an investment banker, which is relevant in the case, in that the way it's portrayed in the media, she was a white, wealthy woman. Five young black and Latina American New York were arrested and convicted of a crime. They were 15, 15 and 16 years old. And Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Anton McRae, Yusuf Salam, and Corey Wise. So they were convicted of the crime. And the media reporting of the case at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, New York, there was high crime rates, violent crime. It was a kind of, this became a symbol of the breakdown, if you like, of that kind of urban society. And it played on a series of fears about urban crime, about race, about class. And so at the time, the case was seen to be, was used as a symbol. The media used a series of racist tropes to report this gang of young black lads running wild, etc., etc. And a New York property developer called Donald Trump took out
I think I've heard of him.
Mhm.
well, what the interesting thing about the story comes back later.
Hmm.
He took out an advert in the New York Post, I think it was, saying that the boys should be executed. This was before they'd been convicted. So this case was a symbol of all these issues around urban violence, urban crime, and of course it cut across. It's a sex crime which gets higher coverage. It cuts across race and class because the perpetrators were at the time the media were saying with these five were a group of young black lads, like young black and Hispanic lads, and there'd been a group of in the park that evening. There'd been about a group of 30 or 40 young black lads. So it's this sort of fear, deep racist fear of black male. So those issues were key in the kind of climate of conviction. So one of the things about true crime and also any wrongful convictions, if you look at the period of the time, the media, the pressure on the police, pressure on someone to find the culprit, etc., can lead to wrongful convictions or is a factor in them. So the media influence in whipping up the hysteria around the crime is a factor then. Then in 1991, so soon after the conviction, Joan Didion wrote an article in the New York Review of Books about the case and about how it reflected the schisms in American society, about the racist tropes that were used, and she raised doubts about the convictions, particularly the reliance on confession evidence. So then, as it turns out, 10 years later, in about 2002, I think, the Central Park Five had served their sentences, but a convicted rapist and murderer, Matthias Reyes, confessed to committing the offence in Central Park. And the convictions of the Central Park Five were overturned and they were, I think technically it's called vacated, and they settled with the City of New York for wrongful convictions and won $1 million settlement. So then, following that chain of events, Ken Burns, the legendary American documentary maker, made a film about the Central Park Five after their convictions had been overturned, using it as a case study, if you like, in the racism in the criminal justice system. In the 2016 election, Trump said that the Central Park Five were guilty, that New York, in fact, I think he actually used the term, he said that New York City had been scammed. They shouldn't have agreed the
Oh, wow.
settlement. So the case came back. So this politics of law and order, Trump was like, very, as Martin was saying, very, very strong on we must crack down on crime. Obviously not the ones he committed, but he was using this as, look, this we need to, this is an example. And clearly it's a racist dog whistle to use that example. And after that, the Oscar-winning documentary maker Anita Duvernay made a film, a docudrama called When They See Us, which is about the case of the Central Park Five. But that was focusing on this wrongful conviction as an example of the injustices in the racial injustice in the American criminal justice system. So this was aired around the times of Black Lives Matter. So it became, in a way, the case then became a symbol of these injustices sometime, almost, where are we, 30 years, 25 years after the case. So it's a fascinating example of the way in which attitudes to crime, attitudes to a case can be influence policy because they're part of, an increase in when they were convicted at that period, there was a huge expansion in the American prison system. America now has over 2 million people in prison. Uh, you know, Overrepresentation of young black men within those systems. There was part of a policy there of the war on drugs and all those sorts of things that trigger mass incarceration, as it's called. But then the case comes back into the public domain, as it were, or wider public domain, because when they see us, is on Netflix and, is a huge success dramatically. And the case then becomes something different, or the reaction to it. So it's an interesting case study in a way that these views can move over
Mm.
time.
And that the case represents different, has been used by different people for
Yes.
different things, I suppose. Like you say, it kind of came back again around Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff.
DuVernay had produced a documentary called the 13th, which is
Oh yeah, that's a
about the
great
expansion
documentary.
of the expansion of mass imprisonment. It's called 13th because the 13th Amendment abolished slavery,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
apart from cases where people are in criminal. So that documentary is a history of the racist portrayal of black criminality, in effect. But that's going to reach a much what. The other thing about these things, a Netflix documentary is going to reach a much broader audience than a Joan. Much as we love Joan Didion, much as, her articles
Absolutely.
in the New York Review of Books is not going to reach that kind of audience. Same with academic work. And in fact, when she produced 13th, a New York socialite who I can't remember his name,
Mhm.
donated millions of dollars to community groups to fight mass incarceration on the basis of having seen
Wow.
that film.
Incredible. Just that one alone is a microcosm of the power of true crime media.
Yeah, and it reflects the way in which attitudes change. People have different approaches to crime, the influence of that crime. And I guess it also shows, a black filmmaker would not have been able to make that film, would not have had access to make those sorts of films in the 1990s,
Mm.
early 1990s. So there's all sorts of things that make that a way of looking at punishment. So, and finally, that when they see us became very influential in making the expansion of the American prison system become an issue of civil rights, which is a very interesting way in which that has developed. So, and in the film, in When They See Us, they have a clip of Trump's newspaper post, and one of the mothers of the Central Park, well, says, makes a really disparaging. I can't remember exactly what she says, but we all know that they're talking about Trump, the president. So it's a kind of that interplay between the two is very good. It's fantastic, but harrowing film.
You have your Ted Bundys, your Jeffrey Dahmers, your Zodiac killers, all the way back to Jack the Ripper, as I was saying at the top of the show today. Very famous people who also happen to be murderers. Jack the Ripper himself, he even has a London tour dedicated to him. These people commit such heinous crimes and they end up becoming quasi celebrities. What does the reverence of these famous names and others tell us about the values within our culture?
Yeah, there's more than one. There's more than one Jack the Ripper tour. The competing Jack the Ripper tours.
Wow.
Isn't it the third most popular tourist attraction in London?
Yeah.
They complete around validity because they all try and at the end tell you who's done it.
Oh, that's
Uh,
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like people say, yeah. And it's this idea you're being taken on the tour of the East End, which I don't know about you, but has changed a bit since 1885, really. So,
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, what's it say about our values? I mean, it's tied in really, I think, for me with the kind of history of our relationship with celebrity and kind of focus on the UK, I suppose. But In the 40s and 50s, I think the celebrities that people were, in admiration of were probably like Hollywood film stars, etc., etc., etc. That's what celebrity was. And then we kind of developed our own homegrown talent. And there was a great Channel 4 documentary on years ago called The Showbiz Set, which showed how the kind of British celebrity kind of emerged in the 50s and 1960s. And then you've got this whole idea of democratization in the 60s, real or not, but certainly the myth of the 60s is where, kings and princes rubbed shoulders with the ordinary man in the street, and people like Michael Caine became famous from working class roots, etc., etc., etc. And the Beatles are highly influential in that. I have written a book about the Beatles, if anyone wants to look it up, but which focuses on their celebrity and the influence of their celebrity, particularly on masculinity. But that's another thing. But within that, I think you get then the emergence, and I think certainly in the book we wrote on the cultural legacy of the Moors murders, Ian and I and another colleague, the Brady and Hindley, who was certainly fit into that kind of celebrity category,
That's Myra Hindley,
and Ian Brady.
Ian Brady. Thank you.
Yeah, the Moors murderers, so called. But the nicknames are important as well, and we'll come back to that because the list you reeled off, a lot of them have nicknames given to them by the media. But the photographs of Brady and Hindley that were taken on their arrest are as famous images of the 60s as the Beatles waving from aircraft steps or JFK, etc., etc. And David Bailey did something called Box of Pin-Ups, the David Bailey photographer, where he photographed what he thought were the key players in swinging London in 1965. And one of those photographs is of the Cray twins, and they're a really interesting. They fit this whole idea about the way that notorious people, become famous and kind of glamorized, really. There've been two films about the craze, one starring the Kemp brothers from Spandau Ballet and a more
Mm.
recent one with Tom Hardy playing both parts. Legend, that's about 2016, I think. But that particularly focuses on the whole glamour aspect of the craze lives and they're moving about in swinging London, etc., etc. So there are these people that become celebrities and are kind of accept, despite the fact that they do terrible things. Not in the case of Brady and Hindley, but certainly the craze are seen with a certain sort of EastEnders type affection, I think, and it's part of the explanation I think about the celebrification of these people is that people, a lot of the academic stuff that we've read about it is about, people transgressing societal boundaries and us being kind of in awe of that in a way, that people dare to do the things that we wouldn't do, that we wouldn't dare to do. And in the case of Ian Brady, he was very, very explicit about this, in that, society's rules, did not apply to him, basically, and therefore he went ahead and did the dreadful things that he did in terms of abducting and torturing and murdering children. So I don't know, what do you think, Ian? Have you got anything to add to that?
Well, I think they also the with celebrity, with notoriety comes celebrity in a sense, and then I think you also see there's particularly this character of the serial killer, which comes into being in the 80s, really. So that's linked to, the FBI developing this notion of what a serial killer is and et cetera, et cetera, the definition of a serial killer. That links to the media. That links to the media. There's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the media, the criminal crime, and then these tellings of these stories.
Yeah, serial killing in particular, I think, as well.
Yeah, yeah, because that's even though people say we're interested in, there's a focus on violence, it's a particular sort of violence. There's not, certainly at this period, there's not a huge interest in domestic violence, there's not an interest in, the cause and roots of this in the media way it's portrayed. Certainly, there's feminist groups and campaigning on these issues, but what I'm talking about here is this high profile. I think in the book there's a quote that nobody ever got famous by beating somebody to death in a back alley. It's that kind of somehow these people become famous. But even within that, there is a hierarchy almost of, people who are So Brady would be seen as, was always in the media, even after his death. Even, there will be there's been a huge number of stories. Whereas Kenneth Erskine, who is a man who murdered pensioners in Stockwell in London in the 90s, doesn't really appear in criminological literature. Now, does that tell us something about him, his crimes, the status of his victims? I think all those things. But celebrity then becomes, it feeds off itself, doesn't it? And, people could be, in a way, we're part of that. We have to accept that we're not going to become famous, but, we're contributing to those sorts of debates and so on and so forth.
Yeah, by writing about this stuff,
Yeah.
we've written this explicitly somewhere, I suppose, that we are part of the serial killing industry or, the true
Mm.
crime industry.
Yeah.
'Cause we're engaging with it. But also, I think the other thing is then, a lot of the certainly stuff that's on TV and the rise of the expert, if you like, or academic or otherwise, and there are several that pop up on our screens all the time. They themselves then become a kind of true crime celebrity in, like we were saying before, coming on the TV, explaining these crimes, recreating the crimes of Jack the Ripper, etc., etc.
So I mean, you have people who are. So there was a series where Amelia Fox, the actress, and David Wilson, the psychologist, reinvestigated the crimes of Jack the Ripper. Well, with all due respect to both individuals, none of them are. They don't have the skills or, what are they doing? One of the things about these kind of status is that there's just so much. If you write a book about true crime, like we've done, or done events around it, one of the things is that people think about every true crime podcast and it would be impossible to keep up with them. It's just
Mm.
not laziness on my part,
Mm.
but there's just like you just can't keep up is my excuse. But there's a lot of money in it. The people who produce the best rated true crime podcasts are making millions. These sorts of crime con, the event, true crime psychologists and professors.
As in like a coming together, a conference
Yeah,
for
yeah,
true crime.
like a fan. Yeah, it's like a
Yeah.
fan conference.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. That's in the book, which I was having a look at last night. Isn't it? Wasn't it like £750 for the whole weekend or something?
Wow.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You can go
for
on a cruise, Rich. You can go on a true crime
Crime
cruise.
Cruise.
two
Yeah,
crime crews. Yeah,
yeah.
get like
So sell out tours from leading authors, and obviously, if you're a top-rated TV show, you're going to make money, aren't you?
or people, yeah, or people touring theatres talking about,
Mm.
couples who kill is one example.
And that's a kind of an ecosystem, isn't it? That's related to,
Mm,
and obviously they're not dependent, but the chapter in the book about the Lucy Letby case shows the way in which that becomes kind of a media obsession. Obsession's the wrong word, but the way in which the media system develops around that. Now, we're not saying at all that there shouldn't be an interest. Obviously, it's a hugely important case for all sorts of, but actually then thinking about how it's presented, how the information, how people get that, how they develop their views, and this comes back to the ethics, the ethical issues that are raised by, some of the things that we've looked at, like the podcast serial, which looked at the case of Adnan Syed. That was in effect, reinvestigating the case. Now there can be positive outcomes to this, in that people are wrongful convictions are overturned or new evidence turns up, but it creates all sorts of ethical dilemmas about the rules of evidence, the rules of these don't apply to podcasts. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act for it does not apply to podcasts, as far as I'm aware. Are people interfering, not deliberately, but obstructing a police investigation in some way? If you look at the case of Nicola Bulley who went missing in Lancashire, that case, the media descended on where she lived and actually got in the way of the police investigation. And there's Lancashire Police. There was a report about how their handling of the media in that, and they'd lost control of the media effectively, which was ended up obstructing the investigation. Now, and that's an example of a case where Nicola Bulley, then her personal life, her family, because of social media, that just was all over the media. And, there's no, I guess once the cat's out of the bag, it's very difficult to manage that sort of situation. So in the case of Serial, which became the most popular true crime podcast, or sort of set it off in a way, you know, the Hai Hai Min Lee, the young girl who was murdered, her family, their views are not really consulted about the making of this program because it's about Adnan Saeed who'd been convicted of a murder.
Mm.
But the case is about her death. So they raises these sorts of issues which are very, very difficult to manage, or how. And so people feel free to comment in Serial. People are putting suggestions, questioning people's alibis and so on, in a way which would be obviously done very differently in a police investigation or in a court scenario.
Well, it takes us back to the question of, why, I mean, why are these things so popular? As you say, this is, the most popular podcast. And it's, it links right back to people's love of being armchair detectives, basically, which is a long history, which takes us back to people reading Agatha Christie novels and trying to guess who done it and all that sort of thing. It's like people feel like they're part of this thing and they're being given the evidence and they're gonna again, the Letby case is just a fantastic example of the way that it's kind of polarized people's opinions due to the fact they've been, fed certain competing narratives.
But the overarching point is that the people they've not been on the jury. We've not been
No.
on the jury. So I'm not saying about the rights and wrongs of that case. I'm just saying the way in which, yes, so and so is definitely guilty. And I guess part of the attraction is, as Martin was saying, you're there. I know I used to read a lot of true crime fiction, but I guess the difference is that it was fiction.
Mm.
So Agatha Christie clearly was fiction and it wasn't making any claims, whereas these citizen detective kind of groups do. So it's not gonna go away. There's suddenly not going to be the true crime podcast market's not going to collapse. I don't think, as far as I can see. And as I said earlier on, there's an endless supply of stories. We could find one now, but it's a bit late to make our fortune. But you could find a case that you say, well, actually, look, nobody's really looked at this. Why don't we? Whereas they focus on the thing about the serial killer and the celebrities, they focus on a particular type of crime. They focus on a particular narrative. They tend to ignore or diminish the status of the victims. In the book we write about the Sutcliffe case and the way that's portrayed, and you can see at the time the police focused their investigation on someone who was killing. Well, they didn't link the cases to begin with. The status of sex workers meant that there was not the level of investigation and so on that was required, or the investigation focused on a particular. We're looking at somebody who's poses a threat to sex workers. Well, you know, they have to take some responsibility. All those kinds of deeply misogynistic attitudes, which ignored or meant that Sutcliffe wasn't apprehended when he could have been much earlier, but also because he didn't fit a particular type.
So you said a little bit ago about Serial. So Serial, yeah, it absolutely exploded in popularity when it came out, specifically chapter series 1.
Yes.
Probably still one of the most listened to seasons of podcasting that's ever existed. And yeah, kind of just like basically jump started an entire industry showing that podcasting and true crime are an absolute match made in heaven. I was a listener at the point when it first came out back in, was it like 2016, something like that, 2015, 2016?
Yeah, 2015, I think.
2015? And
But it's your
yeah,
fault, Rich. That's what
I was one of the people who was great. And I said at the beginning, I'm not a true crime fan, or at least I'm not like a fanatic. But that podcast really grabbed me. And yeah, so you were saying it looks at Adnan Saeed incarcerated for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, and the end result being, and then again, just talking from the perspective of a listener, like, oh, it was so great to follow along, because I'm hoping the whole way through, the way the narrative has been given to us, I'm hoping that this guy who, me listening, like, obviously this guy's not guilty. We need to get him out as soon as possible. Like, I was ready to campaign along with everybody else, just like, we need to free this man. And so, like, for criminal justice, it's a great example of the power of true crime media and the good that it can bring, hoping and assuming that the right person does get freed and that's a result.
Yeah.
But like, you were talking about the ethical issues in that, and I kind of wanted to hear more about like what the ethical problems with the way serial proceeded.
You start from why choose this case? I don't know the process of how that was chosen. I mean, it's a fantastic piece of journalism, but as ever, there are issues raised about the evidence that's used, the way in which the audience are engaged. People were putting forward their own theories on the kind of ecosystem outside of the podcast, which, Sarah Koenig isn't responsible for that, but in some way she is, because she was kind of drawing listeners in by saying, do you know anything about this? It's very skillfully done, but also there are, issues about the way in which the criminal justice system worked. And it's kind of, as you say, what had been the outcome if he hadn't been released? There's people who raise questions about the his release. So I think the ethical issues are around choosing that subject, that individual particularly, but then how people then engage with that. I think he's, as it stands, there was at one point he was going to face another trial, wasn't he? I think, but
Oh, really?
yeah, yeah. But anyway, as you say, the outcome was a very positive one in that a wrongful, it seems, an injustice was overturned.
Mm.
I guess the other thing is that when we're talking about celebrity, Sarah Koenig, the host of Serial, becomes what she was already a very well known, but she goes into another level of celebrity, doesn't she? As a
Mm.
which is she an expert on the? Sometimes you see people who've done these sorts of things then become, presented as experts on the criminal justice system, etc., etc. So I think part of it is the engagement with the people, and obviously the victim in this case was almost totally sidelined, wasn't she?
Is that the case in a lot of true crime media where the star of the show is the serial killer and or the murderer or the
Yeah.
criminal, sorry. And in this particular case it's your Truman Capotes or your Sarah Koenigs or also your star. Can you talk us a little bit more through like the ethical issues of that?
I think there's a pushback on that in
Mm.
more recent podcasts, but particularly there is this, as Martin was saying earlier on, it's part of this celebrity, it's part of this glamorizing. So in the book we look at Ted Bundy. So Ted Bundy is always presented as this, oh, he's this charming, sophisticated, etc., etc., and he just happens to have murdered, well, I don't think anybody really knows how many people he murdered, do they? But it's kind of, yeah, you can see how you fall for his charm. And it's like, well, no, I don't think he is charming.
It's funny, isn't it? Because both in real life true crime. So Louise Wattis, who is a contributor to this book as well, has written something about Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, but with an emphasis on the victims of the
Mm.
crime who are often overlooked. And there is a bit of, as Ian says, a bit of a kickback with this. But then if you look at things like, I don't know, if you look at things that are kind of loosely based on real serial killers, then what you said before is like the serial killer is the hero. So as we speak, my wife will be downstairs watching Dexter, which we've only just come across,
Mm.
who is a blood spatter analyst by day and serial killer by night. I dip in and out of it. You're kind of rooting for him, really. I mean, he's the difference with Dexter. Most of your listeners will probably have seen this years ago. Is that he has this code and he kills bad people. So he kills people that he thinks deserves to die, which has
Mm.
got its own ethical issues, etc. But he is kind of like this, like you say, the star of the show, and you find yourself rooting for him. And I suppose that's not so much in real life true crime. And yet, as Ian says about Bundy, the emphasis is always on, oh, he's this charming man and he charmed all these women into his car and all this sort of thing. And as if somehow he's not a very bad person indeed.
And that minimizes the violence. That's the other thing, is that there's, in the chapter we talk about Anna Rule's book, all these photographs of Bundy, of presenting as this like charming 70s kind of hint of a Kennedy type, which probably isn't the best given their
Not
relationship with
today.
women, given their relationship with women. But anyway, but actually, at the back of Anna Rule's book, who worked with him, wrote the true crime, The Killer Beside Me, there's a picture of him snarling, which you never ever seen before. The sort of inside cover of the first edition of that is him screaming. And you think, well, yeah, this is much more what he's like. But he controlled that image. And Martin was talking earlier on about the photographs of Brady and Hindley. The image of Brady, is a very striking one, particularly in the context of the 60s. And the focus on the serial killer is kind of, there's this sort of, a bit why that kind of gothic, why do we watch horror films? This kind of, we can escape from this for a bit. And, in the thrill of being frightened, etc., etc. But I guess the difference is that, well, Dracula's not real, is he? So, but Brady was, Bundy was. Their victims were real people. So I think and there's a whole memorabilia from serial killers, that you could go online and buy a brick from the house that Jeffrey Dahmer lived in and this sort
Wow.
of thing.
There's a whole collectability thing. There's a book by Gordon Byrne, who's an author that we both really like, called Alma Cogan, which is kind of about the Moors murders in lots of ways. And the main character in this book goes to meet a collector at one point who has all sorts of really bizarre things, and talks about how in the 1960s, Brady and Hindley were essentially convicted by having taped the torture and murder of one of their victims on an old-fashioned tape recorder. And this collector says in Alma Cogan, oh yes, you could go into any pub in Manchester in the 60s and, buy a copy of this tape, basically. So
Oh my lord.
there's a really bizarre market. I think the stuff you see on eBay probably only touches the surface, really. So again, this is all part of this kind of the industry and
Yeah,
the
Mm.
commodification of crime, I suppose, is one
yeah.
of the things we talk about in the book as well, isn't
It never comes up on Antiques Roadshow. They never come up,
it?
but be interesting if it did. But there's that, and there's all sorts of examples. People, Sutcliffe got lots of letters when he was in prison and psychiatric hospital, this kind of thing. Why do people write to people on death row? You know, there's a sort of fascination with people, as Martin was saying earlier, with people who've transgressed. And the thing that I think is that one of the things about that is that just ignores what they've done. It almost yeah, we know he's done this. Bundy, yeah, we know he's murdered, but he escaped from court. Wasn't that dramatic? Wasn't that? Well, yeah, it was, but it's not a good thing. It's and
Yeah.
some of that get lost. I think some of that gets lost in time. So I think one of the things we've seen more recently is in developments in this area is that there's a kickback against that, and there's a going back and reflecting, I think, on some of these cases. So the recent Louise writes about the recent ITV drama The Long Shadow, which was about some of Sutcliffe's victims, and they were portrayed in a there was much more about them, about their background, their lives, their understanding, how they ended up in the position they did in contact with Sutcliffe, either as working as sex workers, and that is something that, well, it didn't happen at the time. Those women were faces on posters of his victims when the police were. There was this massive manhunt for the Yorkshire Ripper, but even calling Sutcliffe the Yorkshire Ripper is glamorising him,
Right.
using that title. That is it a title? Have to be careful with title these days, don't we? Using that as and there's any number of sexual predators who've been called Ripper. If you look at, there's a Camden Ripper. There seems to be a Ripper, for every area,
Hmm.
but we don't know who first coined the term Yorkshire Ripper. But that's distancing that person, isn't it, from the reality of what they've done.
Mm. So yeah, you said here about Louise's work in her chapter about Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper. It was in 1975 that he began his series of murders of women, and you mentioned about the long shadow, that
Yeah,
docudrama from 2023,
yeah,
and in that docudrama, so this is decades after the murders and the justice thereafter. They're still in 2023 in that docudrama, they were still questioning, or at least like kind of like playing to the debate of just like were Sutcliffe's victims involved in sex work, as if it matters. Like what lines of what do lines of investigation like this tell us about our collective attitude to violence against women?
I think they'd probably tell us that they've not changed as much as we think they have.
That's a central. It's a central part of the Ripper case, isn't it? Really, the attitude of the Yorkshire Police Force. The fact that the first time someone who wasn't a sex worker was murdered, their attitude was totally different. I don't know if I can't remember if she described as a good girl or. And I think Ian's right. The recent report, recent reports about the Met, like one a week usually, showed that actually, you know, attitudes haven't really changed.
I think some of them, it's a complex thing, isn't it? But some of them
Mm.
have, and they may have changed it all in organisations. But I think a lot of people, the kind of general view is, the status of the victim. Christie talks about the perfect victim and the perfect victim, meaning from a media point of view, cases that they're interested in, and the perfect victim is probably a child, a white child from a middle class background. Now, sounds like a horrendous thing to say, and on one level it is, but there is a status. There will not be that we were talking about the murders at the beginning in Wakefield Prison. The first thing that will people will be saying, why the people who were murdered were in prison for horrendous crimes. That's the end of the story.
It's like there's two of them gone now. Let's not even
Yeah.
report on it.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you look, which of course I have just done this morning, the people who've been arrested, look at they weren't visitors to Wakefield Prison. They're in prison. They're in Wakefield Prison because they committed horrendous crimes themselves.
Mm.
So this kind of thing is slightly obscure. But I think the status of the victim is something that that attitude is deeply embedded. And it was the case in Ipswich when sex workers were murdered there. There's a time lag. There's something about, well, we're not as concerned about those victims as other sorts of victims. And I think in that way, The Long Shadow was a very good drama, but also it's very honest in that those. It's really easy for us to say now, oh yes, we'd have a totally different attitude, and I'm not so sure that that's always the case.
If today's discussion has got you thinking, then why not take a listen to our friends at the We Society, a chart topping podcast that looks beyond the politics and headlines to explore the intangible connections that hold us together. In each episode of the We Society, journalist and author Will Hutton invites leading thinkers to share the evidence for how we can build a fairer, more connected society. Guests this series include Professor Lucy Easthope, former guest on this podcast, talking emergency planning. They also have the likes of Professor Tim Grant on the power of forensic linguistics and travel journalist Simon Calder. So if you're ready for research-led insights on ideas that could change the way we live, please consider the We Society for your next listen. Find the We Society now on Spotify, Apple, and all major podcast platforms. You talked about Lucy Letby earlier in this conversation today. In 2018, Lucy Letby, a children's nurse, she was arrested on suspicion of 8 counts of murder and 6 more accounts of attempted murder. The papers, they absolutely feasted on this story, coming up with the nickname the Vanilla Killer and constantly pointing out how, quote, normal she looked. News media would often question whether this was what evil truly looked like, trying to appear somber while masking their absolute voyeuristic glee. What does the coverage of Lucy Letby's case tell us about our media landscape, like how it views evil, but also femininity and gender?
Well, the Letby case is a really good contemporary example, I think, of partly, it's become such a dystopian spectacle is one of the quotes that we like to use. It is certainly what the trial was, but the whole media circus surrounding it, I think, is a great example of how people's attitudes have changed. And of course, since the trial, there's a whole debate now about whether the convictions are unsafe, which has polarized many people's views, including Ian and I are in a WhatsApp group with a group of friends that we've known since the 80s. And there's a lot of interesting debate and polarized opinion within that about, some people think that, because Dr. Phil in Private Eye has said that she's innocent, etc., etc. And then, of course, they've had a panel of experts. But I mean, this is all about the case kind of running and running and running. But what does it tell us about? It goes back to how we see people and how we not only see victims but perpetrators. So, there's a whole thing about she's the vanilla killer because she doesn't fit the profile. And there's a lot of academic work now gone into trying to identify, how we might identify serial killers in the future, which is a whole other debate. But anyway, Lucy Letby doesn't fit any of those really. But it's about when we say what interests people, what draws people in, it's about so-called ordinary people doing extraordinary things, I think. And Letby's a prime example of that. You look at her, she's a children's nurse. And it's like Ian was saying about the perfect victim, and it's almost the perfect scenario for the media to latch onto because the victims are all babies, and she's a woman. So female killers are always seen as doubly transgressive. You know, A, they've killed, but B, they've transgressed the boundaries of what we see as femininity and motherhood and all the rest of it, which then inevitably leads on to a big debate about, and in the book chapter, I look at a number of publications that have debated the whole question of evil, including religious magazines, Polly Toynbee, TV Quick, those sort of very kind of populist things. And for a while, there's this whole debate about evil. In our other book, and it's mentioned in this book as well, we'd say that Myra Hindley is probably still seen as the most evil woman in Britain, which constantly comes back. When a case like the Letby case comes up, I think other female serial killers, such as Hindley or Rose West, inevitably, they go back into the archives and they rejig a lot of this stuff as well, and it all comes back. But there's all sorts of other things. I mean, the chapter isn't about did she do it, didn't she do it? The chapter in the book is really about the way that the media has got hold of this case and made it into this kind of dystopian spectacle, which draws in a number of key themes around true crime. And as we were saying before about, the podcasts, so the Daily Mail did a whole year podcasts, which was called
Trial.
The Trial.
They followed the trial. I was on it after the conviction. I appeared briefly on
Oh,
it
yeah.
to talk about some of these issues. But the Letby case is, as Martin was saying, it's almost whilst we were writing the book, it's almost as if this was a case study developing in front of our eyes in ways in which the media become involved and the status of Letby and, they then go and reconstruct things that. So there's lots of you see photos, don't you, from her social media, from Facebook. She's been, I can't quite remember how old she was. She's in her late 20s. She's been on holiday with people and she's enjoyed herself. She had a drink at a friend's wedding, this kind of thing, as though that somehow shows that she's evil because she's done this while she's committing these offences. That
Mm.
kind of thing of she's so ordinary. This is one of the things about serial killers when the media report them. How do we, they're they're banal and ordinary until they've discovered to have done these horrendous things, and then we go back and reinterpret their life to show that they weren't actually ever banal. Or
Mm.
Yeah,
there's a kind of loop here that,
there is a loop. Yeah,
and then you see this photo. The thing about the mugshots and the photos, Martin spoke briefly about Brady and Hindley. Those photos are always then presented as this is a face of evil in that kind of gothic way that you can tell somebody's a wrong un by looking at them kind
Mm.
of idea. And that's those images are very, very powerful. So in the Letby case, they've got images, haven't they, of her on the wards, nursing, etc., and then her being arrested, and that photograph. There's always a photograph of somebody when they've been charged.
yeah. There's two different photographs really, which we talk about in the chapter. There's the happy-go-lucky kind of nurse one, and then there's the mug shot, that they take when people are arrested. And depending on the tone of the story or where the story's up to, the image is really, really important in terms of how they present it. But I suppose what a lot of what I've written about is, how it's become this kind of media and continues to be really a kind of a circus around it. And that's very apparent from the reporting of it. One of the journalists in the New Statesman, described the Daily Mail podcast as pious concern masking voyeuristic excitement.
Mm.
And I think that's a good description of a lot of the
That
cover.
wasn't the episode I was on, was it, Mark?
No, sadly not. But certainly, there's a lot of that in the panorama coverage of it, which I've written about. And
Yeah.
it raises a number of issues. If we go back to kind of policy and policy procedures, the institutional cover-up of the crime, so-called, being investigated at the moment, is part of the story, as is, the status of whistleblowers in public institutions like the NHS. So it raises lots of interesting questions about policy and practice.
But it is going to be, it seems, it's a case that will be the true crime case of the next 10 or 15 years that will
Hmm.
probably. Because either Letby, if there's an appeal and her convictions are deemed unsafe, that is another enormous story, isn't it? Or this will keep going.
Yeah. And compared to the States, we are very short of serial killers in the UK, really. It's a much rarer occurrence. So what?
Thankfully.
Well, yeah, thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully.
But once one appears, then it's the story of this decade, I suppose, as opposed to the Ripper in the 70s and 80s or the West, etc., etc. So, and those stories reappear in relation to new serial killers, I suppose. So it's,
Yeah.
as Ian said before, it's a loop.
Then you have the kind of story of them being in prison. Certainly, Brady and Hindley has huge coverage of them in prison. Perhaps that, I don't know if that's fallen off so much, but
Yeah, there's stories. Yeah, there's a couple of things that we mentioned in the chapter about Letby, palling up to certain people in prison and this sort of thing, and how disgraceful that was. She's keeping bad company in prison, basically, was the thrust of it. But it's just nibbling at the story all the time, I suppose, and hanging on to it and waiting to see what the next development is, if there is. She
yeah.
has a new legal team, and they're trying to put together an appeal.
The other thing is that the families that I mean, there is an inquiry going on, the Thirlwell inquiry at the moment, which isn't into the legal case, it's into the hospital itself, I guess, or the whole, as Martin was saying, what was going on at this institution where these events occurred. Let's put it that way. But also, if you're the parents, the families, the relations. This isn't a story. This is their life, isn't it? These are their lives that are being brought back in. And I mean, clearly, it's horrendous to lose a child, but to lose a child in those circumstances, even more so, I guess. And there's a kind of flippant, or as Martin was saying, that quote from the New Statements about, there's this, yes, we're concerned, but actually, if you're that concerned, I think you'd approach things in a very different way.
Mhm.
Yeah, the ending of the Panorama documentary that I've written about is interesting, really, because of course, there's a dramatic question from the presenter who's at the centre of the whole thing. What turned a likable, fun-loving nurse into a serial killer? But of course, she doesn't answer it. But then one of the parents is asked about her and why do you think she did it? And she just goes, well, I guess that's just something that we'll never know,
Mm.
which seems to be a far more eminently more thoughtful approach to the whole
Mm,
thing, really.
mm,
But as Ian said, these people have lost children, and as the case kind of re-emerges all the time and comes back into the news, there is again the victims are kind of ignored to a certain extent because of the sensational nature of the case, and it's something that the media can get hold of and run with, I suppose.
Our culture, as we've discussed today, it has a fascination with serial killers. I think that would be fair to say from what we've discussed today. Does our celebritization of these murderers pose issues for crime, justice, and policy making? And how could we change things going forward?
I guess does it pose issues? Does it pose issues for policymakers? Well, you can see the influence of not necessarily the influence of them being celebrities, but I think high-profile cases lead to changes in the law, changes in public perception. So, in fact, if you look at now the whole life sentence that can be imposed, that's actually you can trace that back to Hindley's attempts to obtain parole. If you look at the kind of how that changes in policies came about. So I think that they change in that sort of way they do. I guess the other thing about the celebrity is why are some, as I was saying before, why are some of these people celebrities and others not, and how does that impact on their treatment and how they might, be sentenced or are they going to be released or those kinds of issues. And then there's a wider issue about who is a celebrity, as Martin was saying. And I guess that's much more difficult to challenge in the sense of the explosion of social media, the explosion of Netflix, serial streaming, those sorts of things. You just have a huge kind of well to go to of these cases, examples, and they're popular. They're popular. We're not saying they shouldn't be necessarily, but it's about questioning. I guess some of them we're saying they shouldn't be. We're just questioning some of the representations and approaches that are taken. I can tell you that if you do research in true crime, one of the things that it will make you do is stop reading true crime. I think people do engage with some of these issues and think about. I think there has been quite a shift, it seems to me, in people's recognition, perhaps, of the impact of crime, particularly these sorts of crimes, on the wider family community.
I think podcasts have certainly, probably widened the audience in that sense, haven't they?
Yeah, and there's scope to do that further in
Mm.
areas the crimes that true crime essentially focuses on violence, but there's all sorts of other sorts of crime that could be examined in this area, and I think that will increase in.
That's a good point,
Mm.
isn't it? Someone brought that up at the book launch actually as a question. It is mainly kind of violent crime and then leaning towards kind of serial killing and that sort of stuff. But corporate crime is true crime, but nobody's that interested in that at the moment. Could be a niche market
Could be, could
Mm.
be.
but there are different sorts of crimes that don't get this kind of sensationalist coverage.
That have as much an impact on individuals and
Mm.
families and communities. Of well, something like 50% of typical academic, just making up a statistic on on the go. Online scams, huge area, of crime. I'm not sure if there's a true crime podcast about scamming, but probably there
Yeah.
probably is, but I haven't listened to it. But
Mm.
actually, that would be you know, huge. That impacts on people much more than violent crime. I mean, violent crime is fortunately relatively rare.
Yeah, if you were to be able to actually present the numbers of the effect of scams or of massive corporations and their environmental sustainability tolls and things like that, if you could really turn that into digestible information, the public presumably would be horrified.
Yeah. Well, it's one of these areas, isn't it, that people we know it's going on and almost and then but we choose not to. Or it's more difficult to engage with, perhaps. Though there are examples, PPE scandal and so on that can get
True.
coverage.
Post office.
The post office.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's
Mm.
become like a massive, obviously a TV drama, etc., which is then, played out in reality.
But that had been being reported in Private Eye and Computer Weekly for about 20 years.
Yeah.
So it shows the power of, in fact, it shows the power of true crime, doesn't it? If you
Power of
get
true
to,
crime media right there.
Well, that's a good example. And the other thing that I saw the other day was that we talked about this, didn't we? What's her name? Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis, who's the last woman to be hanged in the UK for shooting her lover. They did a dramatisation of her story recently on TV, which isn't nearly as good as Dance with a Stranger, the 80s film about it. But her grandchildren are now petitioning for her to be pardoned based on the evidence that they've seen in this TV drama. So again, it's the way that TV drama, I suppose, around true crime brings up certain cases or brings up certain issues.
but also that case shows the potential generational impact of these crimes
Yeah,
because that's a crime that took place in the 50s and obviously her grandchildren obviously were not born at that time, but
no,
it's still impacted on their lives in
Mm.
obviously a very traumatic way.
yeah.
Well, Ian, Martin, thank you so much for coming on the Transforming Society podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure discussing your book and getting into the details. I've absolutely loved it. So thank you. In a moment, I'm going to let everybody know where they can find your book. But first, could you tell us, is there anywhere we can find you online?
I still have a X account at Dr. Martin King, which I try not to engage with too much now, but I'm kind of out there. Apart from that, I'm an independent scholar, apparently, it says in the book. So I'm very independent.
I'm an independent scholar now as well because I'm
Well, you
retired.
are. You are now,
So,
yeah.
so you can find me as Dr. Ian Cummins at Blue Sky. That's where I am.
Excellent. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
It's been interesting, hopefully.
Definitely. True Crime, Key Themes and Perspectives by Ian Cummins, Martin King, and Louise Wattis is published by Bristol University Press. You can find out more about the book by going to bristoluniversitypress.co.uk and also transformingsociety.co.uk.